Hey everybody, I hope you're having a happy and healthy day. Now, I want to tell you something. Over the past month or so, I've received a lot of nutrition questions and I've given a lot of good answers, hopefully. But what I found is that over 70 to 80% of the questions I received were focused on one specific part of nutrition, and that is carbohydrates. So a lot of people had questions about what's a good carbohydrate, what's a bad carbohydrate, what carbohydrates should I eat, when should I eat them? I realized, wow, there's still a lot of confusion about this topic. And carbohydrates are very important to have an understanding of because they're the most consumed part of the diet typically. So out of the macronutrients, out of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, carbohydrates typically represent between 40 and 60% of the diet. So this is something that can make or break your diet. It can dictate success or it can dictate your failure. So it's very important to get a handle on this. So let's get a little insight into the specifics of carbohydrates, but let's talk about the good carbohydrates versus the bad carbohydrates. Let's look at a couple of different carbohydrate foods. So here we have a bowl of brown rice, and here we have some fruit. We have an orange, we have an apple, Honeycrisp apple here, and we have some unsweetened organic apple juice. So all of these are carbohydrate foods. Before we talk about the differences between these foods, let's talk about the similarities between the foods. So as the portions are pictured here, each one of these food groups is about 50 grams of carbohydrates. So 50 grams of brown rice carbohydrates, we have 50 grams of carbohydrates in the fruit and in the juice. These foods also are about the same caloric amount. These are about 200 calories of each food group here. Now, the biggest similarity between these foods is the fact that all of these carbohydrate foods, and in fact all of your carbohydrate foods in general, your brown rice, your pasta, your bread, all those foods are comprised of two tiny molecules. In particular, they're called glucose and fructose. So every carbohydrate food that you consume contains thousands and thousands of molecules, tiny molecules called glucose and fructose. So on the screen, we see that the glucose molecule is red and the fructose molecule is blue. So if you were to look at under a microscope, if you were to take a piece of bread or a piece of pasta and you look at it under a microscope, what you'll see is the image on the bottom of the screen. You just see thousands and thousands of these different molecules that are in the food. Now the biggest difference between the foods is the fact it's how these molecules, these glucose and fructose molecules, are connections. So the connections between each of the molecules and the amount of the connections will determine whether a carbohydrate is a good carbohydrate, an okay carbohydrate, or a bad carbohydrate in terms of energy, in terms of weight management. Now, let's talk about the differences between these foods. And to demonstrate the differences between the carbohydrate foods, the difference between a good carb and a bad carb, I'd like to use, actually I got one of my favorite candies from my childhood, and if you're my age group, you know exactly what these are. These are the strip of the little candy dots. Let's use this to illustrate what's the differences between a good and a bad carbohydrate. Now, I can eat these dots in one of two ways. Now, the first way I can eat it is I can pull a dot off of the strip and then eat the dot, and then when I'm done eating the dot, I can pull another dot off of the strip and just keep repeating. Now, as you'll see, this takes a decent amount of time, which means that the time that these candies get processed into your system will be spread out. It'll take a little bit longer. So this is method one. Now, the other method I can use, if I didn't have time, I could take just a bowl of these dots or a cup of these dots, and I could just ingest the whole thing at once. This will get into my system a lot faster, very, very fast. So the difference between a good carb and a bad carb is essentially the speed that the glucose and fructose molecules get into your system. So a good carbohydrate, it's going to take longer to take these off, put them in your mouth, swallow them, digest them, and then get into your system. Whereas a bad carbohydrate or a carbohydrate that's worse, these guys can just get in your system right away. So if you think of an apple versus apple juice, same nutrients, but it's the speed that's very different. So now the question becomes, why is the speed of the nutrients getting into our body, why is that so critical? So it's critical from two standpoints, one from an energy standpoint and two from a body composition standpoint, a body fat standpoint. So let's talk about the energy standpoint first. Let's look at the first graph. You'll see the high glycemic index response, and this is essentially how your blood sugar will respond when you eat, for example, the bowl of dots, or the juice, or the candy, something that gets into your system quick. What you'll see is, you'll see a high initial rise of the blood glucose, of your blood sugar. So your blood glucose is going to get high really quick. Now pay attention to as it comes down and it crosses the dotted line around the 3-hour mark. When it goes below that dotted line, that corresponds essentially to our energy crash. So we have low energy here. So think about when you give kids a lot of sugar. They're bouncing off the walls and crazy for a couple of hours, and then they're comatose afterwards. And this is essentially what happens. We get this high energy peak, and then we get a crash. And typically what happens is this happens over and over again. So we get the peak, we get the crash, now we have low energy, and because we have low energy, we tend to eat more carbohydrates, more of the sugar to give us a quick pick-me-up. So then it goes up and then it goes down. So we have this fluctuating repetitive cycle. Now, if we look at the second graph, the low glycemic index rise, this is essentially your strip of dots here. So we get a moderate rise in this blood glucose, but then we have a sustained energy release and we don't have that crash. So if you put two of these graphs together, you can see the difference. So that's the difference in terms of energy. Now let's talk about how these carbohydrate foods can affect our body composition, our weight management, our body fat. So when we eat carbohydrate foods, that causes a rise in blood glucose. And with that rise in blood glucose, that causes a corresponding increase in a hormone called insulin, which is secreted by the pancreas. Now the insulin is designed to take all of those glucose and fructose molecules that were in these foods and to bring them to our cells where they can use them for energy. Now here's the critical fact. When our blood glucose goes high, which causes our insulin to go high, that insulin causes our fat-burning hormones to be down-regulated. Basically, it causes those fat-burning hormones to be turned off. So the higher and longer our blood sugar is high, that means it's a longer time that our fat-burning hormones are turned off. And for weight management purposes, obviously, we don't want those fat-burning hormones turned off for very long. So basically, if you take your sugar, your cup of dots, your bowl of dots, your high glycemic carb, the bad carb, if you eat that, then your blood glucose goes high and it stays high for a while, which causes our fat-burning hormones to be turned off for the same amount of time. So high blood sugar, no fat burning. So if you had a better carb or a good carb, let's say brown rice or sweet potatoes, that's going to cause a moderate increase in blood glucose, which causes a smaller increase in insulin, which means that our fat-burning hormones, even though they might be turned off for a little while, they'll get turned on much more quickly because our blood glucose levels weren't high. So that's the big difference between those foods. So team, I hope this video was helpful for you. And remember something, we're in a time right now where we might not be moving and exercising with the same pace and intensity that we used to move. So it's very important that our nutrition is as strong as possible to make up for the deficiencies that we have now in our exercise and our movement. So choose your carbohydrates wisely, stay happy, and stay healthy, my friends. Have a great day.